For a decade, Soviet submariners ruled the Atlantic with absolute confidence, certain their patrols through the GIUK gap left no trace. They were the invisible masters of the deep, moving with a swagger born of silence. Then, with no warning, American destroyers began appearing directly above Soviet patrol zones, right on top of their boats. The ocean floor, once their greatest ally, had become a silent enemy. How did an invisible network turn masters of stealth into targets overnight? This is the story of the breakthrough that exposed the Soviet underwater empire, the moment everything they believed was shattered, and how the SOSUS network flipped the underwater war on its head. Inside a Soviet submarine, routine was everything. The men moved through cramped passageways with practiced ease, their boots echoing on steel, the air thick with oil and sweat. Each crew member knew his place, from the gruff torpedo officer to the youngest conscript peeling potatoes in the galley. The boat itself was a world apart, sealed off from the surface, humming with the constant vibration of engines and machinery. Noise was part of life. Soviet engineers set broad standards for what counted as quiet, and the crews rarely questioned it. The metallic clatter of tools, the whine of pumps, even the laughter after a successful drill, none of it felt dangerous. In those days, the Atlantic seemed endless, a shield that swallowed up every sound. There was a kind of pride in this isolation. Sailors gave their boats nicknames, some mocking, some affectionate. A November class might be called the Roaring Cow for its deep, rumbling reactor, a name spoken with a wink and a slap on the hull. Veterans remembered the rituals, the initiation of new crew, the toasts after surfacing from a long patrol, the competitions to see who could identify a distant ship by ear alone. The sense of mastery ran deep. Officers swapped stories about evading American destroyers, boasting how their boats slipped through the GIUK gap unseen. They joked that the Americans could not find their own shadows, let alone a Soviet submarine in the open sea. One retired sonar operator from Murmansk remembered the confidence of those years. He described the routine, long stretches of quiet watch, the low thrum of the main engines, the gentle sway as the boat rode the Atlantic swells. The only real tension came from mechanical faults or the occasional near miss with an iceberg. He recalled the crew's certainty, almost arrogance, that no Western technology could reach them at depth. He remembered they were the ghosts. They listened to the Americans, not the other way around. Noise discipline was more tradition than necessity. There were rules about dropping wrenches and slamming hatches, but few worried about being overheard. The Atlantic, after all, was their ally. The crew trusted the vastness of the ocean, the thickness of the water, the old charts that showed patrol routes as empty blue. Even the youngest sailors felt shielded by distance, convinced that their world was invisible to anyone above. The only reminders of the outside came from Moscow: orders, coded messages, the occasional update on American fleet movements. To the men below, these were distant concerns. Their focus was on the rhythms of the boat, the camaraderie of shared hardship, and the unspoken belief that they owned the deep. That confidence shaped every day. When a patrol ended, the return to port was marked by celebration, bragging ceremonies, medals, and the telling of close calls that grew more dramatic with each retelling. The crews believed they were untouchable, masters of a game the West could barely play. In the mess, over mugs of strong tea, they laughed at the idea of American sonar reaching them. For these men, the Atlantic was not just a battlefield. It was home, fortress, and playground all at once. On every Soviet submarine, the chart table stood at the center of command, a battered slab of wood or metal covered with grease pencil marks, naval maps, and stacks of patrol orders. Officers gathered around, tracing their fingers along the blue expanse of the North Atlantic, plotting routes that threaded through the Greenland, Iceland, and United Kingdom gap, known as the GIUK gap. The GIUK Gap was more than a geographic feature. It was the accepted gateway from the Barents and Norwegian seas into the open Atlantic, a narrow corridor that promised both access and protection. Soviet naval doctrine called it the safest highway to the American coast. Strike arc diagrams, penciled in by hand, swept westward from the GIUK Gap, curving across the Atlantic to touch targets on the eastern seaboard of the United States. These arcs were not just symbols, they were the backbone of Soviet strategic planning. Every transit, every patrol was built around the assumption that the GIUK Gap could be crossed in secrecy, that the vastness of the Atlantic would erase any trace of a submarine's passage. Declassified route maps from the 1960s show a spider web of planned tracks radiating from Murmansk and Polyarny, converging at the gap before fanning out into the deep. Patrol orders emphasized speed and unpredictability, but the underlying confidence was clear. As long as a boat slipped through the GIUK undetected, the rest of the ocean was a sanctuary. The Atlantic's depth and the masking roar of storms were believed to be allies. Commanders trusted that American sonar, limited by range and surface clutter, could not penetrate the ocean's heart. The only real threats seemed to be the unpredictable weather, the risk of mechanical breakdowns, or the rare chance encounter with a NATO patrol. Inside Soviet naval headquarters, planners refined these routes with mathematical precision. They calculated optimal depths, engine speeds, and even the best times of year to avoid NATO exercises. The GIUK Gap's currents and underwater topography were charted in detail, but the focus was always on evasion, not confrontation. Soviet doctrine taught that the Atlantic was too large, its waters too complex for any surface fleet or listening post to monitor every submarine. This belief found its way into every operational order and every training manual. The charts themselves became talismans of this faith, their penciled lines a promise of safety. Strike arc diagrams were updated after every patrol, each new line reinforcing the idea that Soviet submarines could reach American shores undetected. The confidence was institutional. Officers briefed their crews on the invulnerability of their routes. The GIUK Gap was treated as a narrow but reliable keyhole into the Atlantic, and once beyond it, the ocean belonged to them. The chart table was where this doctrine took shape, where the myth of invisibility was renewed with every new patrol plan. Years would pass before anyone questioned whether the ocean was truly as silent and empty as those maps suggested. A Soviet sonar officer from Severomorsk remembers the first time the old certainties began to crack. Out in the Atlantic, his November-class submarine was running a routine patrol when the hull shuddered with a faint, unfamiliar vibration. It was not machinery or the ocean's usual groans. This was something else, something that set every nerve on edge. He logged the anomaly, but the captain dismissed it as a trick of the current. A few days later, the same crew surfaced in a prearranged patrol zone, expecting nothing but empty water. Instead, a US destroyer appeared on the horizon, bearing down with uncanny precision. There had been no radar contact, no intercepted radio chatter, just the sudden silent arrival of an enemy ship exactly where they were not supposed to be found. Rumors started to ripple through the fleet. Crews whispered about ghost pings, short bursts of active sonar that seemed to come from nowhere, bouncing off hulls in the dead of night. Some officers joked about American witches, but the laughter did not last. Patrol logs from the early 1960s show a growing unease. One entry, dated June the 26th, 1962, noted an unidentified acoustic event at 03:47 hours, just as the submarine crossed the edge of the continental shelf. The handwriting grows shaky in later pages. That same summer, a classified message from Moscow warned all captains to report any unusual sonar contacts, even if they seemed harmless at first. On the other side of the ocean, the US Navy shore stations were quietly amassing a new kind of evidence. At Navafact, Cape Hatteras, technicians hunched over rolling paper strips called lofargrams, searching for the faint telltale lines of a Soviet reactor or propeller. On June 26, 1962, the gram printer recorded a distinct low-frequency signature moving west through the GIUK gap. The timestamp, 0347 hours, matched the Soviet log almost to the minute. Within hours, a destroyer was vectored to the submarine's predicted location, arriving so quickly that the Soviet crew barely had time to react. The Americans never revealed how they found their target, and the Soviet captain filed his report as an unexplained coincidence. Stories like these multiply. One veteran recalls the feeling of being hunted by something invisible, a presence that pressed against the hull but left no trace on their own sonar displays. Some crews began to suspect their boats were leaking signals, or that there was a spy in Moscow feeding routes to the Americans. The old bravado faded. The Atlantic, once a place of security, started to feel haunted. Every unexplained ping, every sudden appearance of a US ship chipped away at the idea that the ocean was still on their side. By the end of 1962, the tone in Soviet wardrooms had changed. Officers gathered in hushed circles, comparing notes about strange encounters and near misses. The sense of mastery was gone, replaced by a creeping sense of dread. Somewhere out in the deep, the Americans were listening, and no one could say how. Beneath the surface of the Atlantic, a new kind of net was quietly taking shape. It did not catch fish or trap ships. Instead, it listened. The first pieces of this net were laid down in January 1952 off the coast of Eleuthera in the Bahamas. Engineers from Bell Labs and the Office of Naval Research lowered a 1,000-foot line of hydrophones, 40 underwater microphones spaced along the continental slope, set at a depth of nearly 1,500 feet. These sensors tapped into the SOFAR channel, a deep layer where low-frequency sounds could travel for hundreds, sometimes thousands of miles without fading. The physics was simple but powerful. A submarine engine or propeller, even if faint, would send vibrations rippling through this natural sound highway, reaching distant shores with clarity no surface sonar could match. A retired NAVFAC technician remembers the first time the Eleuthera array picked up a distant submarine. He describes the moment as almost surreal. He says they watched the lofargram come to life, just a thin, steady line on the paper. But they knew no whale made that sound. The technicians learned to read these frequency traces like signatures. Each class of Soviet submarine, November, Hotel, Victor, had its own acoustic fingerprint, a hum or a rhythm that set it apart. The gram printers rolled day and night, spitting out paper strips marked by the telltale patterns of machinery deep below. By 1954, the network was spreading. Arrays stretched along the US coasts and out to Hawaii, each one linked to shore stations and naval facilities by thick armored cables. The processing rooms were dim and cold, filled with the constant whir of tape reels and the soft scratch of pens on paper. Operators sat in front of banks of displays, eyes trained for the faintest sign of a Soviet boat. The system did not just listen, it pointed. Beamforming allowed technicians to pinpoint the direction and range of a contact, turning a single hydrophone whisper into a sharp bearing across the ocean. The Atlantic, once thought limitless, was mapped by invisible lines of sound. The breakthrough came in the early 1960s. On July 6, 1962, NAVFAC Barbados recorded the unmistakable signal of a Soviet nuclear submarine crossing the GIUK gap. The detection was not a fluke. Within weeks, other stations began logging similar contacts, each one tracked in real time as it moved through the Atlantic. The effect was immediate. In the space of a few months, the number of successful intercepts spiked. Submarines that had once vanished into the blue were now plotted, their movements traced from shore to shore. The system's reach was staggering, over 1,000 miles in some cases, with the GIUK gap transformed from a hidden gateway into a monitored corridor. The technician recalls the shift in mood. At first, they thought it was luck, but then it happened again and again. It was as if the whole ocean floor had come alive with secrets. Soviet captains, still unaware of the net below, tried standard evasions, diving deep, slowing engines, hugging thermal layers. None of it worked. The hydrophones heard everything, cutting through water and distance with clinical precision. In just a few months, the doctrine that had guided Soviet patrols for years was overturned. The Atlantic had become a fish bowl, and the hunters were suddenly, undeniably, the hunted. Inside the steel hull, the old routines dissolved into something unfamiliar. The steady hum of machinery, once a comfort, now sounded like a warning. Sailors who used to joke about noisy pumps began to treat every vibration as a threat. A sonar operator from the Northern Fleet remembered the change. He said, "We started listening to ourselves, not the ocean. Every shift brought new caution. Men walked softer, checked each hatch twice, and wrapped tools in rags to muffle their work." The captain ordered drills at odd hours, testing how quickly the crew could silence the boat. Even the kitchen stopped clattering dishes. Sleep came in fits. Some men kept their boots on, waiting for the next alarm, haunted by stories of American destroyers appearing without warning. Rumors spread that someone in Moscow was leaking routes, or that the Americans had a spy buried deep in the fleet. Officers pored over intelligence updates and old patrol logs, looking for patterns, but nothing explained how US ships kept appearing in the right place at the right time. The suspicion turned inward. Maintenance teams were ordered to tear down engines and insulate every bracket and pipe. New directives arrived: quiet the pumps, refit the bearings, check the seals. But no matter how many bolts were tightened, the sense of safety never returned. One veteran described the silence as suffocating. He recalled, "We were used to noise, laughter, even arguments. Now every sound felt dangerous. Every footstep was a risk." The fear was not just of the enemy, it was of being heard, of the ocean itself betraying them. The Atlantic, once their shield, had become a vast listening ear. In those tense patrols, the crew learned to dread the sound of their own submarine more than any distant threat. Orders from Moscow arrived with a new kind of finality. Patrol routes that had threaded the GIUK gap for years were struck from the charts, some overnight. The familiar blue corridors, once symbols of freedom and reach, were now labeled as too dangerous to cross alone. Soviet planners, who had once boasted of the Atlantic's endless cover, began issuing directives for coordinated group transits, wolf packs, not solo boats. These new formations were meant to mask individual signatures, hoping that the noise of several submarines together could blur the lines on an American LOFAR-gram. But the cost was clear. What had once been routine now required the commitment of entire squadrons just to slip through the old gateways. Declassified naval records from the mid-1960s list dozens of patrol corridors abandoned or restricted. Routes through the GIUK gap, the Norwegian Sea, and even the approaches to the Barents were redrawn, some erased completely. The logistical strain was immense. Maintenance schedules stretched thin as more boats were kept at sea for longer periods, and crews rotated with little rest. The old doctrine, one boat, one mission, silent and invisible, was gone. Now every Atlantic patrol was a gamble, with the odds growing worse each year. Naval historians describe this as the moment the balance of power truly shifted beneath the waves. The sense of mastery that had defined a generation of Soviet submariners vanished, replaced by caution and calculation. The Atlantic, once their hunting ground, had become a gauntlet. It was not the American fleet that forced the retreat. It was the ocean floor itself, wired and listening, that drove the Soviet Navy from its own map. The ocean floor still listens. Today, undersea surveillance cables span continents, and the race for acoustic dominance shapes every new submarine design. As boundaries blur between sonar, AI, and deep-sea drones, the lessons of SOSUS echo louder than ever. In the invisible war beneath the waves, whoever holds the silence holds the power. How much of that silence is truly ours? Share your thoughts below.